The twins were tied to the fence with old, worn twine, their bodies pressed against the weathered wood. The townsfolk had gathered in a loose circle, watching them like animals in a cage. The children's faces were pale, cheeks streaked with dirt, eyes wide and frightened. They didn't move much, just hung their heads low, too ashamed to meet the gazes of the people who stood in judgment. Their stomachs growled, hollow and empty. The apples were long gone. They had stolen them, but it didn't matter now. They were punished for something that wasn't their fault, because someone had to pay. The rancher was a shadow in the distance, sitting still on the porch of his house, watching. The old wood creaked as he shifted in his chair, not bothering to make a sound. His boots were dusted with dirt, the same color as the land he owned. The sun hung heavy over the horizon, casting a long shadow across the valley, stretching between him and the children. The world felt quiet in a way that only silence could make it. He didn't move at first, he didn't even blink. His eyes stayed fixed on the twins, the way their shoulders sagged, the way their legs were bound tight to the fence, the way they kept their eyes down as if hoping to disappear into the earth beneath them. The townsfolk murmured, soft voices cutting through the silence. "Teach 'em," one man said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Let them know what happens when they steal." "They ain't even old enough to know better," a woman replied, her voice thick with judgment. "But they'll learn." The rancher's jaw clenched, his fingers curling around the edge of his chair. His eyes stayed on the twins, their small bodies trembling in the afternoon heat. The whispers of the town were nothing to him. He didn't need their approval. It wasn't right. It wasn't right to tie children to a fence for stealing apples. There were worse things in this world. The rancher stood slowly, the creak of the chair like the snap of a twig breaking underfoot. His boots hit the ground with purpose, and he walked toward them. No one said anything, no one moved. The dusty road beneath his feet was dry, cracked from the heat, and his steps were firm but steady. He didn't speak. He never spoke. His silence was a part of him now, a weight that settled over his shoulders like the coat of a man who had seen too much. But his eyes, the way they looked at the twins, spoke louder than any word ever could. When he reached the fence, he didn't hesitate. He cut the twine with a single motion, the sharp snap of the rope echoing in the empty air. The twins flinched, their eyes still on the ground, too afraid to look up. But when they heard the soft rustle of movement, they dared to lift their heads. The rancher's hand extended to one of them, then to the other. His fingers were rough, calloused, worn from years of working the land. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He didn't ask for forgiveness or offer any explanation. He just led them away from the fence, past the townsfolk, past the murmurs and stares. They walked silently behind him, their small hands held tight in his, the ground beneath them softening with every step. The rancher didn't look back. He didn't need to. The twins followed without a word, their feet dragging in the dust. The porch was close now, the house looming ahead, its frame a quiet, brooding thing against the fading light of the day. The rancher opened the door and stepped inside, the twins trailing behind. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the harsh light, the eyes of the town, the judgments that had been laid upon them. The house was still. The air smelled like old wood, dust, and something forgotten. A table sat in the center of the room, its surface scarred from years of use. A single chair beside it, empty. The rancher pointed toward it, the gesture simple and unhurried. The twins sat down, their bodies tired, eyes still wide and uncertain. The rancher took a step back, his gaze sweeping over them, over the house. There was no warmth in his eyes, not the kind the children might have expected. There was nothing to say. The silence was a constant companion here, one that never left. The house didn't speak either. It just stood there, its bones groaning under the weight of its years. It wasn't a place of comfort, it wasn't a place of joy, but it was a place of refuge, and for now, that was all the twins needed. The rancher moved to the stove, his back turned, the soft scrape of metal against metal filling the silence between them. He pulled a pot from the shelf, set it on the stove, and lit a small fire beneath it. The twins watched, their eyes heavy, their bodies still. They didn't speak. The silence stretched out between them, thick and heavy. It felt like a weight in the room, but it was a weight the rancher had learned to carry long ago. His eyes were soft now, the hard edges of his stare replaced by something more distant, something more personal. The twins shifted, their bodies shifting with the weight of a new understanding. They were here. They were safe, for now. There was no one to punish them anymore, no one to judge them. The rancher wouldn't speak, but he had given them something far more valuable than words. The room was quiet. The only sound was the fire crackling softly in the corner. And in that silence, the twins finally let themselves rest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The door shut behind them with a soft click, the weight of it settling in the space between the twins and the rancher. Inside, it was dark, the shadows long and stretching across the room. The air was heavy, thick with dust that hung in the stillness, untouched by wind or movement. The twins stood in the doorway, staring at the house that would become their home, their bodies stiff, their eyes wide, as if afraid to blink and miss something. The rancher didn't speak. He never spoke. He moved past them toward the stove, the scrape of his boots muffled against the floorboards. He reached for a tin can, the metal clinking softly as he set it on the counter. His movements were measured, deliberate, like a man who didn't need to hurry. The silence wrapped itself around the room, pressing down on them. The twins remained where they were, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to ask for what they needed. The hunger gnawed at them, but they didn't speak. They didn't ask for food, even though it was clear they hadn't eaten in days. The rancher didn't offer any. He just moved silently, the soft hiss of the stove the only sound, besides the distant murmur of wind outside. The older twin, a girl, shifted uncomfortably on her feet, her hands clutching the hem of her shirt. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something to hold on to. She caught her brother's gaze. They didn't need to speak. They both knew the same thing. This wasn't like the other places they had been. This wasn't like the orphanage or the streets. It felt different here, heavy, like the air itself had a weight. The rancher set a bowl of beans down in front of them, the smell of the food making their stomachs twist in hunger. Neither of them moved to take the bowl right away. They just stared at it, the silence pressing in, thick and suffocating. They didn't trust it, not yet, not him. Finally, the girl reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the bowl. Her brother followed, his hands trembling slightly as he scooped up a handful of beans. They ate without speaking. The food was cold, but it didn't matter. They ate because they had to. They didn't look at the rancher. They didn't need to. His presence in the room was a constant, like the house itself, like the silence that clung to everything. His eyes, though, never left them. They could feel him watching, waiting for them to speak, waiting for them to ask questions. But they didn't. The weight of the quiet kept them still. When they were finished eating, the twins sat there for a long time, staring down at their empty bowls, unable to meet the rancher's eyes. The quiet stretched on, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around them like a blanket. Finally, the rancher stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked toward the door without a word, opening it slowly, letting the evening light spill into the room. He gestured for them to follow, and though they hesitated, they did. They stepped outside, the cool air hitting their skin. The sky was dark, the stars visible in the distance. The rancher didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions were enough. He pointed toward the barn, then to the house. A simple command, unspoken. The twins nodded, their feet moving as if on instinct. They worked without a word, helping him with the horses, brushing them down, making sure they had food for the night. The barn smelled of hay and dust, the air thick with the scent of animals and earth. It was familiar, a comfort in its own way. But still, there was silence. Always the silence. They worked until their hands ached, until the night had stretched on too long and the moon hung high above them. The rancher watched, his back to them, his eyes never straying far from the barn. When it was done, the rancher nodded, his movements slow but sure. The twins followed him back to the house. The door clicked shut behind them, and again the silence returned, settling in like an old friend. They stood in the middle of the room, unsure of where to go. The rancher went to the fire, stoking it with wood, his face shadowed by the flickering light. The twins sat again, not speaking, their bodies tired from the work but their minds restless, full of questions they didn't know how to ask. Outside, the town murmured. They could feel it, even if they didn't hear it. The whispers about the rancher, about his strange silence, his odd ways. "They're just kids," a man's voice had said earlier in town. "Ain't no reason to keep them. He doesn't care for them. He's just trying to get on good with the sheriff." "Not everyone takes in orphans without a price," another voice had warned. "You wait. You'll see. He's got a plan for them." The twins didn't know what to believe. They didn't know what the rancher's plan was, or if there even was one. They just knew that they were here, and they were safe. For now. But the silence felt like a trap. It was too heavy, too thick to escape. Every time they tried to move, to think, to feel something else, it wrapped itself around them tighter, squeezing out any hope of understanding. They didn't sleep. Not really. They lay on the hard floor, their bodies sore from the day's work, but their minds racing, chasing thoughts they couldn't put into words. The rancher didn't speak, didn't check on them. He simply sat in his chair by the fire, the orange glow casting long shadows on his face. The silence stretched on. The fire started small. A flicker at the edge of the barn, barely more than a wisp of smoke curling up into the air. But in this dry heat, where the grass barely touched the ground and the sun had baked the land for days, a small spark was enough. The twins were in the house when they saw it, an orange glow dancing against the window, flickering like a warning. "Fire!" the girl screamed. Her brother was already moving. They didn't need words anymore. They ran toward the door, their feet slapping against the floorboards, the air thick with fear. The rancher was already outside, standing at the edge of the barn, his eyes locked on the growing flames. His face was expressionless, as if he had seen this before, had seen far worse. The twins ran to him, breathless. "What do we do?" the boy asked, panic in his voice. "Get the buckets," the rancher said. His voice was low, steady. He didn't look at them when he spoke. He didn't need to. His eyes were fixed on the fire. The twins scrambled toward the well. The wooden bucket creaked as they lowered it into the water, pulling it up with trembling hands. Their hearts hammered in their chests as the heat from the fire pressed in on them, suffocating the air. They could feel the smoke in their lungs burning their throats. The rancher didn't move, not yet. He stayed where he was, watching the fire lick at the sides of the barn. It was spreading fast now, the flames curling up the walls, licking the roof. The twins ran past him, their arms full of water, dousing the edges of the fire with desperation. They didn't speak. There was no time for talking. Only action. The boy threw water on the flames, his hands shaking as he tried to catch his breath. His sister was right behind him, sloshing water in every direction. They worked like they had been doing it for years, but it wasn't enough. The fire was faster, stronger. The barn was burning too quickly. The rancher finally moved. His boots hit the dirt with purpose, slow but sure. He grabbed the boy by the arm and pulled him away from the flames. "Not here," he said, his voice hard. He pointed to the far corner of the property where the wind was weaker. "Over there, keep it away from the fence." The twins followed him without question, running to the opposite side of the barn. The rancher's silence cut through the chaos. There was no panic in his eyes, no fear, only focus. He led them, guiding them, showing them where to dump the water and how to angle it to have the best chance. The flames were fierce now, the wind carrying them further across the dry land. The rancher moved with the fire, his pace unhurried, his hands steady. The twins worked frantically beside him, their bodies soaked with sweat, their arms aching from the strain. The sky above them was darkening, smoke swirling through the air like a storm cloud. The heat from the fire radiated off the ground, and the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. "Keep going," the rancher said. His voice was calm, as if they weren't fighting for their lives, as if this wasn't their only chance. The boy looked at him, confusion in his eyes. "Aren't you afraid?" The rancher didn't answer. He just kept throwing water, his movements measured, almost mechanical. It was as if he had been through this before, as if this was nothing new. The twins exchanged a look, but they didn't ask any more questions. There was no time for that now. There was only the fire. It took hours. The fire refused to die, clawing at the barn, consuming the wood and the hay. The twins' muscles screamed for rest, but they kept working. The rancher didn't stop either. Even when the barn began to collapse under the weight of the flames, he didn't look away. Finally, when the fire began to die down, the rancher stepped back, his chest heaving with exertion. His eyes never left. The ruins of the barn. The wind had died down, but the smoke still hung heavy in the air, curling around them like a ghost. The twins stood beside him, exhausted, their bodies covered in ash, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. They watched the last of the flames flicker and die, the crackling of the embers filling the space left behind by the burning wood. The rancher didn't say anything. He didn't even move. He just stared at the ruins of the barn, his face expressionless, his posture rigid. It wasn't anger or sadness that showed in his eyes. It was something else, something darker. The boy stepped closer to him, his voice hesitant. "It's gone." The rancher nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. The wind carried the scent of smoke and charred wood. "You've lost it, haven't you?" the girl asked quietly, her voice small. The rancher's hand twitched, but he didn't answer. He just kept staring at the barn, the fire now nothing more than a memory. The twins stood there, their eyes tracing the wreckage of the barn, and it hit them then, the depth of the rancher's grief. It wasn't just the barn he had lost. It was everything. They didn't ask him about it. They didn't need to. They understood. The rancher wasn't just a man of silence. He was a man shaped by loss, by something that had been torn away from him, something he couldn't get back. The fire was just one more piece of it, one more thing taken. They didn't speak again. The rancher didn't either. The three of them stood in the ashes, letting the silence wash over them, knowing that it wasn't the fire that had destroyed them. It was the weight of what had been lost long before the flames ever touched the barn. The rancher turned away from the ruins and walked toward the house. The twins followed him, their steps slow, heavy. They had no words to say. There was no point in speaking now. The twins were playing near the back of the barn when they found it. The ground was soft, the dirt easily disturbed by their small hands, and beneath the surface, buried deep under layers of earth, they discovered a stone. At first, they thought it was just another rock, another forgotten piece of the land, but then they saw the edges of it, the shape too perfect, too deliberate. It wasn't a rock at all. The girl knelt first, brushing the dirt away with trembling fingers. Her brother joined her, and together they uncovered a small, weathered headstone. The name was faint, barely readable. A few letters were still visible, but the rest had been worn away by time and the weather. It was old, much older than the barn, older than anything they had seen on the ranch. "What's this?" the boy whispered, his voice filled with unease. The girl didn't answer. She just stared at the stone, the strange, unmarked grave staring back at her, like it was waiting for someone to remember. "What's it say?" the boy asked again, his voice rising in confusion. "I can't tell," the girl murmured, her brow furrowed. She wiped the dust from the stone again, her eyes scanning the worn letters. "It's too faded, but it's here. It's real." They looked at each other, both of them uneasy. Something about the grave felt wrong. Later that evening, as the twins sat at the table, they couldn't shake the feeling. The grave was still on their minds, gnawing at them, the silence between them filled with questions they didn't know how to ask. They glanced toward the rancher, who sat across from them, his gaze unfocused, his expression as unreadable as always. The girl spoke first. "There's a grave behind the barn." The rancher's eyes flicked to her, his face giving nothing away. "What's it for?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The rancher didn't answer. He didn't even move. His silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. She pressed on, her curiosity too strong to ignore. "Whose grave is it?" His fingers tightened around his cup, the only sign of tension in his body. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to the fire, his eyes hardening, something dark flickering in them for just a moment. The boy spoke this time, his voice shaky. "You don't talk about it?" The rancher's gaze shifted slowly back to them. He met their eyes, but the silence was all that followed. The girl couldn't stand it anymore. "We're not stupid. We saw it. The grave. It's yours, isn't it? You buried someone there." He looked at the floor, his lips pressed tight together. Still, he didn't speak. The twins looked at each other, both feeling the weight of the moment, both sensing that there was something more, something the rancher wasn't saying. That night, the girl couldn't sleep. The darkness in the room was suffocating, the silence too heavy to ignore. She lay in the bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The air felt too thick, too oppressive. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of the grave, of the rancher's silence. And then, as she closed her eyes, she heard it. A voice, soft, distant, like a whisper in the wind. She froze. The voice called her name. She sat up in bed, heart racing, sweat forming on her brow. The room was still, and the voice had vanished, but she knew what she had heard. She crept out of bed, her feet silent on the floor, her body tense with fear. She reached the window and looked out into the night, but all she saw was the dark, empty stretch of land, the barn looming like a shadow in the distance. She stared at it for a long time, wondering who the voice had belonged to. Was it the woman from the grave, the one the rancher had buried? She returned to bed, but the question lingered in her mind. Who was she? And why had she called her name? The next day, the sheriff arrived. His horse's hooves struck the dirt with a rhythmic thud as he rode up to the house, his eyes scanning the land like a hawk, watching its prey. The rancher didn't greet him. He didn't even acknowledge his arrival. He simply stood on the porch, staring out at the land. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft crunch. He didn't waste time. "I heard about the fire," he said, his voice gruff. "A man loses a barn. A lot of things go with it. People start asking questions." The rancher didn't move. He just stared straight ahead, the silence hanging between them like a heavy fog. The sheriff shifted his weight, leaning against the porch railing. "You been burying things out back?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost casual. The rancher's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sheriff smirked, a dark glint in his eye. "People talk. They say you've been living with ghosts for a long time. They say you buried a woman, your wife maybe, or someone else. It doesn't matter. The grave behind the barn, it's not the only thing that's been buried around here." The rancher's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, the tension between them felt like it would snap. But he didn't speak. He just stood there, silent, waiting for the sheriff to say whatever it was he was going to say next. The sheriff took a step closer. "You don't get to keep your secrets forever. People want answers." The rancher's voice finally broke through the silence. "And people always want answers. That doesn't mean they get them." The sheriff's smile faded, and he stepped back, his eyes lingering on the rancher for a moment longer before he turned and mounted his horse. "I'll be back," he said, his voice dark with warning. "You won't be able to hide forever." The rancher didn't move until the sound of the sheriff's horse faded into the distance. The twins stood behind the door, listening. They didn't need to speak. They knew. The truth was buried out there, and it was something the rancher would never tell them. The first time the rancher spoke about names, the twins didn't understand. They were sitting at the table, eating quietly. When he said it, his voice low and steady. "You're not who you were anymore." They didn't look at him, not at first. The words felt strange, out of place. It was like a warning that didn't make sense. The girl, the older twin, hesitated before looking up. "What do you mean?" "Your old names don't matter. You're part of this now." His gaze never left the fire in front of him. The flickering light caught his eyes, casting shadows over his face. "From now on, you'll be someone else." The boy looked at his sister, his brow furrowed. They didn't need to say anything. They understood the weight of his words without speaking. The rancher set his bowl down and stood up. "No need to hold on to who you were. You've got a new place now." The twins exchanged a glance, a silent question hanging between them. The girl's lips parted, but the boy spoke first. "What will we be called?" The rancher paused, turning to them, his expression as unreadable as always. "Call each other what you want, but around here, your names are Lucy and Eli." "Lucy?" the girl repeated, tasting the name on her tongue. It didn't feel like her. She didn't feel like Lucy. "Eli?" the boy whispered, as if testing the name in his mouth. "I'm Eli now." The rancher's face remained impassive. "That's who you are now. That's who you'll be when you step out into this land. Forget everything else. Start fresh." It wasn't what they expected. It wasn't like the quiet mornings back at the orphanage or the crowded streets, but they didn't argue. There was nothing to say, nothing left to say. The next day, they went to the barn as Eli and Lucy, just as the rancher had named them. Their hands were stiff, their movements more deliberate than usual, but they worked. They worked like they had always worked. There was no turning back now. Over the days that followed, the silence between them and the rancher didn't feel like an absence anymore. It became something more. It became a thread that tied them together in ways they didn't fully understand. He didn't speak much, but the way he moved, the way he looked at them, it was enough. They weren't just children being kept on the ranch. They were part of it now, part of the land, part of his silence. They began to feel it more and more each day. When they worked in the fields, when they fed the animals, when they sat at the table in the evening, the silence between them and the rancher felt like something solid. It wasn't oppressive. It was just there. They began to realize they didn't need to fill the empty space with words. The sheriff came back days later, just as the sun was setting. He rode in slow, his horse's hooves clicking on the dirt road as he approached the ranch. The twins heard him before they saw him, the sound of the horse growing louder in the distance. The rancher didn't move. "Don't speak to him," the girl whispered to her brother, her hand tight on his arm. He didn't need to ask why. They both knew. The sheriff had questions. He always had questions. The sheriff stopped at the edge of the porch, looking at the rancher, his eyes cold but calculating. "Thought I'd check in," the sheriff said, his voice low and steady. "See how things are going here." The rancher didn't answer. He just stood there, watching the sheriff, his eyes narrow. The sheriff took a step closer, his boots crunching against the dirt. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" he said with a smirk. "But people talk. They say things about you, about the twins." The rancher didn't move, didn't speak. His silence seemed to fill the air between them. The sheriff waited, but the rancher didn't answer. "You're keeping them here, aren't you?" the sheriff continued, his tone sharpening. "You don't ask questions, just take them in like they're your own. You're a good man, I'm sure, but I can't help but wonder about their past, about where they came from." The rancher didn't budge, his face unreadable. Lucy and Eli watched from the window, their eyes wide, their breath shallow. They wanted to know what would happen. They wanted to know if the rancher would speak. The sheriff stepped closer, his gaze flicking over to the twins' small figures at the window. He raised an eyebrow, his smile curling into something darker. "You sure they're not hiding something?" the sheriff asked. Still, the rancher said nothing. He didn't move, he didn't flinch. His silence was more than enough. The sheriff stood there for a long moment, waiting, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the rancher. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, but he didn't back down. "I'll be keeping an eye on you," the sheriff muttered, his voice low, full of warning. "The town talks, and I'll be asking more questions. You can't keep hiding the truth forever." The rancher finally shifted, his movements slow, deliberate. He stepped back inside the house without a word. The sheriff watched him for a moment longer, then turned and mounted his horse. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. Lucy and Eli stood at the window, watching the sheriff ride off, the dust rising behind him. They didn't speak either. They knew by now that words weren't needed. Inside, the rancher continued to work, the weight of his silence heavy in the room. The twins followed him, the new names they carried like an old coat, one they didn't quite fit into. But they had no choice. The past was gone. And now they were just Lucy and Eli. But they felt it then, the heavy burden of the rancher's past, the secret that lingered in the house, in the barn, in the land. The sheriff's questions, his suspicions, they were just the beginning. And they were no longer just children. They were part of this. They had no choice but to accept the silence. The letter arrived in the late afternoon, its edges frayed and worn, as if it had been carried a long way. The twins had been outside, working alongside the rancher, their hands dirty from the day's labor. They didn't notice it at first, tucked away under a pile of old tools on the porch. The rancher hadn't noticed it either, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun began to set, casting a long shadow over the land. When the twins came in for supper, the letter was still there. The rancher had gone inside, the door creaking shut behind him. He didn't speak, didn't even glance at the envelope. His silence was heavy, suffocating the room. But the letter, it caught the twins' attention. The girl was the first to spot it. She bent down, her fingers brushing the rough paper. Her brother hesitated, then followed her gaze. "What's that?" he asked, his voice a whisper. She picked it up. slowly turning it in her hands. The name on the envelope was barely legible, but she could make out the rancher's first name. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, a sharp contrast to the rough, crumpled paper. "It's for him," she said softly, "from someone." Her brother looked at her, his eyes wide. "Who?" "I don't know," she replied, her fingers trembling slightly. "But it's addressed to him." They exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Neither of them said a word as the girl slowly opened the envelope, pulling out the letter inside. The paper crackled as she unfolded it, and the twins leaned in together, reading the words in the dim light of the room. "To the man who once held my heart, I write this with no hope of a reply, only to let you know that I have not forgotten you. The years have passed and much has changed, but I still feel the weight of our time together. I cannot undo what was done, but I can ask you to come back, to return to the place where we were once happy. I still remember you, still remember the way you looked at me, the way we promised we would never part. I know it was never meant to be, but my heart has never stopped calling for you. Please come back. Please come home." The girl's breath caught in her throat as she read the last line. Her fingers lingered on the paper, as if it could answer the question she hadn't spoken. "Who is she?" the boy asked quietly, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," she whispered back, staring at the words, her mind racing. They didn't speak again. The silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as they folded the letter back carefully and placed it on the table. The rancher didn't come in for a long time. When he didn't acknowledge the twins sitting at the table. He went straight to the stove, as if nothing had happened, as if the letter hadn't just arrived. His back was turned to them, his shoulders stiff. The twins sat there, the weight of the letter pressing down on them. They didn't know what to say and didn't know how to ask him about it. The questions, who was she? Why hadn't he opened it, hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Finally, the girl couldn't stand the silence anymore. She stood up and walked toward him, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Why didn't you open it?" The rancher didn't move. He didn't even look at her. "Doesn't matter," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "It matters to us," she said, her eyes pleading for an answer. "Who is she? Why didn't you ever tell us about her?" His hands tightened on the edge of the stove, his knuckles white against the wood. He finally turned to them, his eyes dark and empty. "She was someone I loved," he said softly, the words heavy on his tongue. "But I couldn't keep her, and I couldn't keep the promise I made to her." The twins stared at him, their hearts aching with the weight of his words. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to reach him. The rancher looked down at the table, his face softening for the first time in days. He picked up the letter, his fingers tracing the edges of it, but he didn't open it again. "Some things are better left buried," he muttered, more to himself than to the twins. He turned away from them, walking out of the room without another word. The twins stayed there, their gazes locked on the letter still lying on the table. They didn't move for a long time. The rancher didn't return that night. He didn't come to the table for dinner, didn't say a word before bed. The silence between them felt colder now, more absolute. The twins stayed in their room, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had just happened. In the darkness, the girl couldn't stop thinking about the letter. The words were still there, burned into her mind. "Please come back. Please come home." But he hadn't come back, and the silence in the house was louder now than ever before. The rancher didn't speak to them about it again. He didn't mention the letter, didn't explain who she was. It was as if the letter had never existed, as if it had been erased from time itself. But the twins knew better. They knew that the silence was only a mask, a way for him to bury the pain. The rancher wasn't just silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because there were things he could never tell them, things he would never share. The sheriff came again, his horse's hooves heavy on the dirt road as he rode up to the ranch. The twins were inside, trying to stay out of the way, but they could hear his voice from where they stood by the window. The rancher was on the porch, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sheriff's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" The sheriff's words were sharp, accusing. The rancher didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, the silence stretching between them like a rope pulled taut. The twins watched from the window, their bodies pressed against the glass. They couldn't hear every word, but the tension in the air was thick, palpable. The sheriff stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dirt. "You think people don't talk? You think they don't notice the things you try to hide?" The rancher's eyes narrowed, but he remained still. The sheriff was getting too close, too insistent. "Those kids you've got here, they ain't just some lost souls you're saving," the sheriff continued. "There's more to it than that. I know it. I can feel it." The twins exchanged a look, their hearts racing in their chests. They could feel it too, the weight of something dark, something buried beneath the surface. The sheriff was too close now. He was speaking to the rancher, but it felt like he was speaking to them too. His voice dropped lower, as if he was trying to get the rancher to break. "I've heard stories about you, about the woman. The one you buried behind the barn. Your wife, wasn't it?" The rancher stiffened, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it would break. The sheriff saw it, but he didn't back down. "Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about," the sheriff pressed. "You buried her, didn't you? You buried her like you buried everything else, the family you lost, the life you left behind. You think no one's noticed? You think people just forget about that kind of thing?" The twins were too scared to breathe, too afraid to move. They didn't know what to think, didn't know if they should run or stay, but they couldn't tear their eyes away from the confrontation unfolding on the porch. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low, tight with something raw. "You think I did it for me?" he asked. "You think I buried her for me?" The sheriff stood silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You buried her because you couldn't keep her. That's why you keep everything buried, because you don't want anyone to know what you lost." The rancher's eyes flashed, and for a moment the twins saw something in his face they hadn't seen before. Pain. The kind of pain that twisted his features, that made his jaw set hard. He turned away, walking toward the edge of the porch, his back to the sheriff, his shoulders rigid. "She didn't deserve to die like that," the rancher muttered, almost to himself. The sheriff didn't answer, but the twins could hear the weight of his silence. The tension hung thick, suffocating the air. The twins couldn't take it anymore. They slipped out of the room, their footsteps silent against the floor. They moved through the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible. They reached the back door, slowly pushing it open. They needed to hear, needed to understand what was happening. They crouched low behind the shed, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could still hear the sheriff's voice, though it was softer now. "You think I don't know what it's like to lose someone?" the sheriff asked, his voice quieter, almost compassionate. The rancher didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking out at the horizon. "I lost my wife too," the sheriff continued, his words measured. "But I didn't bury her. I didn't hide her away like you did. You don't deal with it that way. You face it, you let it burn you up, but you don't bury it." The rancher turned slowly, his eyes dark. "I'm not you," he said, his voice rough. "I couldn't face it. I couldn't bear it. So I buried her. I buried her, and I buried everything else with her, everything I thought I lost." The sheriff shook his head. "You think keeping it buried keeps you safe?" The rancher's hand clenched into a fist. "It keeps them safe." The twins looked at each other, their eyes wide with confusion. What was he talking about? Who was he trying to protect? The sheriff's voice softened, almost like he was talking to a child. "You're not protecting them by keeping this quiet. You're making it worse." The rancher's gaze softened just for a moment. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel it every day?" The silence stretched out between them, heavy, thick. The twins could feel it, even from behind the shed. They didn't know what the rancher was hiding. They didn't know what was buried behind the barn, but now they understood something else, something deeper. The rancher was running from his pain, from the ghosts of his past, but they were always there, always waiting. Finally, the rancher turned away, walking back toward the house, his footsteps slow, deliberate. "Tell the town what you want," he said, his voice quiet. "They'll never understand." The sheriff didn't follow him this time. He stood there for a moment, watching the rancher walk away before turning his horse and riding off into the distance. The twins waited for a long time after the sheriff left, their bodies frozen in place. Finally, they came out from behind the shed, their hearts still racing. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew one thing for sure. The rancher wasn't just a man of silence. He was a man shaped by grief, by loss, and whatever he had buried, whatever haunted him, it was more than they could have ever imagined. The twins went inside the house, their minds heavy with questions they didn't know how to ask. The rancher didn't speak that night. He didn't explain. He didn't try to make it better. He just sat in the chair by the fire, the shadows playing across his face, and the twins sat with him, the silence between them thicker than ever before. The twins had settled into their new roles, each day blurring into the next as they worked the land alongside the rancher. The rancher didn't teach them with words, but with actions. Every movement he made, the way he fed the horses, the way he tended to the fields, the way he fixed the fences, spoke of a life lived with purpose, a life that demanded hard work and silence. Lucy and Eli adapted quickly. They learned to feed the cattle, to carry water from the well, to fix the barn door when it squeaked. The silence between them and the rancher wasn't empty anymore. It was something deeper, something that felt like belonging. They weren't just orphans on a strange land anymore. They were part of the ranch. They were his now. At least, that's what they told themselves. The days stretched on, and as they worked, they began to feel the weight of the land beneath them. The ground wasn't just dirt. It was something older, something that had seen the rise and fall of many like them. They could feel the history in it, could feel the ghosts that walked just out of reach. The rancher never said anything, but they didn't need him to. They knew the way to the barn, knew how to gather the eggs from the chickens, knew when to let the fire burn low. There was a rhythm to their days now, a rhythm that felt like it had been written into the earth long before they arrived. But that rhythm was shattered one afternoon when the man arrived. He came riding in from the north, his horse kicking up dust as he pulled up in front of the ranch house. The twins were working in the field, their hands dirty from digging up potatoes when they heard the sound of hooves. They stopped, looking up, squinting against the sun. The man was tall, his coat dusty from the road, his hat low over his eyes. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud that seemed to echo through the quiet. "Looking for someone?" Lucy asked, wiping her hands on her pants. The man's eyes scanned the ranch, his gaze sharp and calculating. "I'm looking for the twins," he said, his voice rough from travel. Lucy and Eli exchanged a quick look, unease creeping into their chests. "I'm their uncle," the man continued, his gaze never leaving them. "I'm here to take them home." Lucy stepped forward, her heart pounding. "We don't know you." The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "You will. I've come to get you, both of you. Time for you to go back to the town. The ranch ain't no place for kids." Eli took a step back, looking toward the house. "We don't want to go back," he said softly, his voice shaking. "You don't have a choice." The man's tone was final, his words heavy with the weight of authority. "Your aunt and uncle have been looking for you for months. They've been worried sick." Lucy felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The thought of going back to the town, to the noise and the crowded streets, made her feel sick. She couldn't go back, not after everything that had happened. Just then, the rancher appeared, his boots silent on the ground as he stepped onto the porch. He said nothing. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked briefly to the man before settling on the twins. The stranger shifted uncomfortably under the rancher's gaze. "I'm here for the twins," he said again, his voice growing defensive. The rancher didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge the man's words. He simply moved toward the porch, his hand resting on the rifle that hung against the wall. He didn't need to say anything. His actions spoke louder than any words could. The stranger's eyes flicked nervously toward the rifle, then back at the rancher. He took a step forward, his hand going to his own holster. "You don't have to make this hard," he said, his voice low. "I'm just here to take the kids home." The rancher's fingers tightened around the rifle. There was no threat in his movement, just a simple warning. "Leave them be," the rancher finally said, his voice low and steady. The words weren't loud, but they were firm. "They stay here. They belong here, now." The man hesitated. He could see the strength in the rancher's stance, the silent power that came from years of living with the land. He swallowed hard, his grip on his holster tightening. "They don't belong here," he said, his voice rising. "They belong in town with their real family." "Your family don't want them," the rancher said, the words soft but cutting. "They don't need to be reminded of what they've lost." The stranger looked like he might speak again, but the rancher's gaze silenced him. There was something in those dark eyes, something that said, "You won't win this fight." The man's hand moved away from his holster, and he stepped back, a reluctant nod escaping his lips. "I'll be back," he muttered, turning toward his horse. "But don't think this is over. You can't keep them forever." The rancher didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His silence was a wall the stranger couldn't breach. The man mounted his horse, giving the twins one last, lingering look before he rode off, disappearing into the dust. Lucy and Eli stood frozen, their hearts still racing, their bodies tense. They didn't know what to say, didn't know how to feel. They had been ready to go with him, to leave the ranch, to leave the silence behind. But now they understood something more. The rancher wasn't just their protector. He was their anchor. As the sun began to set, the rancher turned away from the road, his rifle still resting on his shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The twins followed him back into the house, their hearts still heavy with the weight of the stranger's visit. "Are we staying?" Eli asked quietly. The rancher didn't answer right away. He just nodded, his back to them as he moved toward the table. "You're here now," he said, his voice steady. "And you'll stay." The twins sat down at the table, their minds still spinning with the visitor's words. But the rancher's silence, his calm presence, was enough. For the first time, they understood. They belonged here, and no one would take that away from them. The stranger didn't leave quietly. He had returned by the time the sun was setting, his horse kicking up dust as he made his way down the dirt road. The twins could hear him before they saw him, the rhythmic pounding of hooves breaking the evening stillness. They were inside the house, sitting at the table, pretending not to notice the way the air in the room thickened with tension. The rancher was at the window, his back turned to them, his hand resting on the windowsill, as if he was bracing himself for the inevitable. They all knew the man would come back. They had expected it. But now that he was here, they weren't so sure about what came next. Lucy sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Eli's eyes flicked toward the door, but he didn't move. They waited in silence, as they always did, until they could hear the stranger's voice cutting through the quiet. "I'm not leaving until you come with me." The man's voice was harsh, his words pointed as he stepped onto the porch. "You belong in town. You don't belong here." The twins didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. They knew. They had made their decision. Lucy stood up first, her body tense with defiance. Eli followed her, his face set with determination. The rancher didn't move, but they could feel him watching them as they stepped outside to face the stranger. "You're not taking us back," Lucy said, her voice clear and firm. There was no room for negotiation in her tone. The stranger looked at her with an edge of disbelief in his eyes. "You don't have a choice," he said. "This is where you belong. You don't know anything about that man inside. He's not your family." Eli clenched his fists at his sides. "We don't need you to tell us who we belong to." His voice cracked with the weight of everything they'd been through. "We've been here long enough to know." The stranger's gaze shifted between them, frustration and anger building in his chest. "He's not your father," he spat, "and he never will be." The twins stood their ground. Their eyes never left the stranger, and though there was fear in their hearts, there was something stronger now, something they hadn't known was there before. They were stronger, and they wouldn't go back. The rancher appeared in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the fading light of the day. His hand rested on the doorframe, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his body told a different story. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. The stranger's eyes darted to him. "You're not their father," the man said again, more forcefully this time, as if repeating it might make it true. "You can't keep them." The rancher's eyes narrowed, but he didn't answer. The words were not his to speak. Lucy and Eli stepped forward, standing side by side. "We're staying," Lucy said. Her voice didn't waver, even though the weight of the moment threatened to crush her. "We're his family now." Eli nodded beside her, his jaw clenched tight. "We belong here, and you don't get to decide that." The stranger opened his mouth to argue, but the rancher stepped forward, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. His boots thudded against the wooden porch, and his shadow loomed over them like a storm cloud ready to burst. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't oppressive. It was the kind of silence that comes after an agreement is made without words. The stranger's eyes flicked back to the twins, and then to the rancher. For a moment, it seemed like he might fight back. But he didn't. He didn't even try. With one last look, he turned, mounting his horse with quick, practiced movements. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't hide forever." The rancher didn't respond, didn't even flinch. The man rode off into the distance, the sound of the hooves fading into the night. Lucy and Eli stood there, watching him leave. The air felt lighter, though it hadn't changed. They didn't know if they'd made the right choice, but for the first time in a long time, they felt like they had something worth fighting for. The rancher turned to face them, his back still straight, his expression unreadable. The twins waited, their hearts pounding with uncertainty, their breaths shallow. He looked at them for a long moment, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he finally spoke. "You made your choice," he said, his voice quiet but not unkind. Lucy looked up at him, her chest tight. "We belong here," she repeated, more to herself than to him. The rancher's eyes softened just for a moment. Then, with a slow nod, he gave them something they hadn't expected. "You do," he said. His voice was quieter now, as if the weight of his words was finally settling into place. "You're mine now, too." Lucy's breath caught in her throat, and she felt the sting of unshed tears in her eyes. Eli's face softened, and for the first time, they felt it. The bond between them, the tie that held them together in this place, in this life. The rancher didn't smile. He didn't need to. The words, simple as they were, meant more than anything else he could have said. The twins walked back into the house with him, their feet lighter than before. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and the house felt more like a home than it ever had before. The silence wasn't just their burden anymore. It was their connection. They had made their choice, and they had chosen each other. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land as the rancher led the twins to the edge of the property. They walked behind him in silence, the dust from the dry earth clinging to their boots. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness that made their steps slow, like they were being drawn into something old and forgotten. The rancher didn't speak, but they didn't expect him to. His silence had become familiar to them, a constant presence that they no longer questioned. They reached the spot behind the barn where the land dipped slightly, a gentle slope that led to a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing, barely visible through the overgrown grass, was a weathered stone. The name on the stone had long since faded, the letters worn away by years of wind and rain. The grave was small, unmarked by time, but it felt significant, like the earth itself had been waiting for this moment. The twins stood at the edge of the grave, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to feel. The rancher didn't look at them. He simply stared down at the stone, his face unreadable. Lucy took a step forward, her eyes tracing the lines of the grave, the name barely visible. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice soft, as if speaking too loud might disturb the silence that hung in the air. The rancher didn't answer right away. He knelt beside the grave, his hand brushing the top of the stone, his fingers lingering on the cool surface. "My family," he said finally, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper. "They were mine." Eli moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to ask more, wanted to know everything about the woman who had been buried here, about the life the rancher had lost. But something in the way the rancher spoke held him back. There was a finality in his words, a weight that made it clear this was not a story to be told in pieces. "Your wife?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling with the question she'd been holding in for so long. The rancher nodded, his gaze fixed on the grave. "She was my wife, and my daughter is here too, both of them." The twins stood in the silence that followed, the words hanging in the air like smoke. The past had come full circle, and they could feel the weight of it pressing down on them. The rancher had never spoken of this before, never mentioned his wife or his daughter, but now, standing here, the truth seemed undeniable. The wind picked up, rustling the grass around the grave, but there was no sound in the air except for the steady beat of their hearts. The land felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something more. Lucy felt her throat tighten. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you say anything?" The rancher didn't answer right away. He stood, his back to them, his hand still resting on the grave. The silence stretched between them, But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just the rancher's silence. It was the silence of the land itself, of all the things that had been buried here. Eli's eyes moved from the grave to the rancher's back. Were we ever really wanted? He asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of a truth they hadn't yet understood. The rancher didn't turn around, but they could feel him stiffen. Finally, the rancher spoke, his voice low and heavy. I didn't bring you here because I wanted to forget. I brought you here because I don't want you to forget. The twins stood there, the weight of his words settling over them like a shroud. They weren't just orphans anymore. They were part of something deeper, something tied to the earth and the land itself. They weren't just his responsibility. They were his family, whether he spoke of it or not. The rancher turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. You were never meant to be forgotten, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You are mine now, and I will never let you go. The twins exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with the understanding of what had been said. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of a happy ending. It was something more, something deeper, something they couldn't name, but something they felt in their bones. They weren't just part of the ranch anymore. They were part of the rancher's history, part of the land that had shaped him, part of the pain that had driven him to silence. As the sun sank lower in the sky, the twins stood with the rancher, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a barrier. It was a connection. They were his family now, and that was enough. The wind had a way of moving through the ranch, whispering across the fields like it had always been there, like it was part of the land itself. The twins, now older, stood side by side in the early morning light, looking out at the horizon, the soft glow of dawn casting long shadows over the earth. The air was cooler than it had been the night before, a reminder that even in this endless stretch of land, change was constant, inevitable. Lucy and Eli were no longer the children who had arrived here, wide-eyed and full of questions. The land had shaped them as much as the rancher had. Their bodies were stronger now, their hands calloused from years of working the earth. Their eyes had lost the uncertainty they once carried, replaced by a quiet strength that only came with time. They had learned everything, the feel of the soil in their fingers, the weight of the responsibility that came with the animals, the rhythm of the seasons that controlled everything they did. They had learned to work in silence, to listen to the land, to trust in it. It was their home now, as much as it had ever been the rancher's. Think we'll ever get used to this? Eli asked, his voice low, almost lost in the wind. Lucy didn't answer right away. She looked out at the fields, the faint outline of the barn in the distance. The land stretched out before them, endless, and yet it felt like it was closing in on them. The weight of it, the responsibility, was starting to feel too much. Maybe, she said, her voice soft but certain, maybe we already have. Eli looked over at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he was seeing her for the first time in years. They were different now, both of them. They had grown into themselves, into the people the land had always expected them to become. They had found their place here, found the purpose that had eluded them for so long. But the question lingered. Could they ever really leave? Could they walk away from this place and find something else? Do you ever think about leaving? Eli asked, his voice quieter now, like the question held more weight than he was willing to admit. Lucy looked at him for a long moment, her gaze distant. She had thought about it. Of course she had. The idea of something more, of a life beyond the ranch, had crossed her mind more than once, but there was something here, something rooted so deep in her that the thought of walking away felt impossible. No, she finally said, shaking her head. I don't think I could leave, not for good. Eli didn't say anything else. He just nodded, understanding her in a way he never had before. They were bound to this place, whether they liked it or not. The land had a hold on them, and the rancher, though silent, had become a part of them, as much a part of their blood as the land itself. The rancher stood at the edge of the porch, his back to them, watching the horizon as he always did. He didn't speak, didn't move. But they both knew he was watching them. They always felt his presence, even in his silence. He had given them everything, even when he couldn't say it out loud. "Do you think he'll ever leave?" Eli asked, his voice quieter now, as if the question itself was too heavy to bear. Lucy didn't answer. She didn't need to. The rancher wasn't just a man to them, he was the land. He was the past, the present, the future. His silence wasn't something to be broken, it was something to be understood. "Maybe not," Lucy said finally. "But that doesn't mean we can't live." They both stood there for a long moment, watching the rancher, their hearts heavy with the weight of their own decisions. The world felt endless, and yet it felt small too, as if everything they needed was right here, in this place, on this land. The wind picked up, rustling the grass, and for a moment the sound of it felt like a conversation, like the land itself was speaking to them. It was quiet, but it was there. It always has been. The twins returned to their work, side by side, as they always had been. They were no longer the children who had arrived at the ranch, wide-eyed and unsure of who they were. They were young adults now, stronger, wiser, and capable of handling the weight of what had been given to them. And yet, as they worked together, side by side, they knew that no matter where they went, no matter how far they traveled, the ranch would always be their home. They didn't need to ask the question anymore. The land had already answered for them, and so had the rancher, in his own way. They were his family now, as much as the land was his, and no matter where they went, they would always carry his history with them. They would always carry this place in their hearts. The silence between them, between the rancher and the twins, wasn't just the absence of words. It was a bond that couldn't be broken, a connection that would last longer than anything they could put into words. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final light across the fields, they understood. The past didn't fade. It was always there, tied to the land, to the people, to the silence. It was always waiting for them to remember. And they would. The sun had set, leaving a faint glow on the horizon, and the ranch stood quiet, as it always had. The twins stood side by side, their hands resting on the old fence, looking out over the land that had been their home for so many years. The earth was soft under their feet, the fields stretching endlessly in front of them, the barn in the distance a reminder of what they had built. It felt like a lifetime since they had first arrived, tied to a fence with no place to go. They had grown stronger here, not just in their bodies, but in the way they understood the world, the land, and the rancher who had brought them into his silence. The rancher, now gone, had left more than just a house behind. He had left them with this place, this legacy, and with it, the silence that had defined him. Eli turned to Lucy, his eyes dark but steady. "He never said goodbye." Lucy nodded, her gaze still fixed on the land. "He didn't need to." Her voice was soft, almost reverent. "He left everything in silence." The silence between them was no longer oppressive. It wasn't a void. It was something they had come to understand over the years, a bond, a presence that filled the spaces where words could never go. It wasn't a punishment. It was the legacy of the man who had taught them everything without ever saying a word. The wind blew across the fields, the faint rustling of the grass, a reminder that the world still turned, even when no one spoke. The house behind them stood as it always had, silent but full of memories. The barn, the well, the old wooden fence, they were all part of a story that had begun long before the twins arrived and would continue long after. They didn't need to say anything more. They had worked the land, kept it alive, just as the rancher had done for years. It was their home now, and in its quiet corners, in the rustling of the trees and the steady beat of their hearts, they could feel his presence. His silence was their inheritance. Together they turned and walked back toward the house. The sun had fully set now, and the first stars of the evening twinkled above them. The rancher's legacy was more than just a place. It was in the land, in the silence, in the work they had done and would continue to do. They would never forget him. The final silence was not an end. It was a beginning, a promise that no matter where they went or what they did, this land, this house, and this silence would always be their home, and they would carry it with them forever.